Hello and welcome to our third episode of Royal Service by Stephen Barry. I hope you don't mind that I'm doing it on my gossip before bed chair because I'm here alone and it's too hard to turn all the lights back around and everything on my own, on my crutches. So I am just going to do it here and I hope you will forgive me for this one episode. So we're up to chapter 5 and it's titled Bed and Breakfast. So let's go. Okay. One thing I've learned very quickly is never to try to talk to a royal before 11 o'clock in the morning, unless absolutely necessary. Anyone who does is liable to get a regal glare that says without words, "Go away." And he says that the prince loves to wake up to the sound of the radio, so he would tiptoe into his room at 7:50, draw back the curtains very quietly, then turn on the radio, which would gradually, gently waken him. Then he would slip into the bathroom and run his bath, half your luck. And then back in the bedroom, he'd look for signs of life, and then he'd leave. Then exactly 15 minutes later, he would come back in with a footman with the breakfast. So, no, that's the part that I envy. To be woken like that, just gently awakened every morning, having a bath run for you and then have your breakfast arrive. Wouldn't that just be the best? So at 8:05, he would be eating his breakfast. Then at 9:30, I would go in and ask about lunch and so on, sorting out what he wanted to eat for the rest of the day. Now, on tour, of course, it was a different kettle of fish. They'd have to be up and at 'em and, on the go. But breakfast was still Stephen Barry's responsibility on tour. And he says his own favourite cereal that they used to take, guess what it was? Bran flakes. So then Prince Charles enjoyed bran flakes. I wonder if he still does enjoy. I believe he has his own special organic Highgrove muesli now. And their own honey and their own chocolate Oliver biscuits for which he had a passion and enough lemon refresher to last us for however long they were going to be overseas. Now, that lemon refresher drink was actually brought up a lot in Housekeeper's Diary by Wendy Berry. Stephen Barry and Wendy Berry, I've got to get that right, and evidently was a favourite of Diana's as well. And so they both weren't big drinkers of alcohol. They just loved this lemon refresher, evidently. When we travelled, we either stayed at Government House, the British Embassy or a hotel, very rarely at people's homes. He says that in hotels, managers would be determined to put on a really good show. So they would always go over the top with everything. If they ordered breakfast, if they ordered one croissant, they would end up with 6. Everything was always overladen. And so Stephen Barry used to actually order the breakfast 15 minutes early so that he could clear all the excess food off the trolley, because it used to really upset the prince. The prince would scowl at it and say, there's enough here to feed a family of 4. And he would say to Stephen Barry, "Have you eaten?" And invariably Stephen Barry had eaten, because he used to grab a piece of toast while he was clearing the tray of all the food. So, it's a pity. And I guess, they wouldn't be able to facilitate that going to a homeless shelter or anything. They're just too busy. They'd have to go off to their engagement or whatever. But yes, so that used to happen. And he used to say, you'd have to also clear off the hotel matches and all the advertising and all that sort of thing. There was always a great rush when he ate, if they were actually leaving that day for another place, because Stephen Barry would have to run around packing up everything and there'd be a mad scramble to the airport, just like the rest of us. And Stephen Barry would say that he had to remember to grab his cereal and his honey off the breakfast trolley. And invariably, the first question when they got on the plane was that then Prince Charles would say to Stephen Barry, "Did you get the honey?" "Yes, Your Highness," I would say, trying to keep a note of weariness out of my voice. "I've always brought the honey." He was paranoid about the honey. If there was half a spoonful left, it still had to be gathered up. And also Stephen Barry said he learnt to never travel without safety pins, because once they were in Papua New Guinea and he had to actually deliver some medals from the Queen, some gongs. And the trouble was that in Papua New Guinea, the women didn't have a lot of clothes on up top. They evidently had some, but nowhere where the prince felt he could really pin anything. And he didn't know what to do. And he was looking out the window and saying, oh my goodness me, where am I going to actually pin these? And Stephen Barry came up with a brilliant idea. He actually joined all these safety pins together, created a necklace and put the medal on the end of this safety pin necklace. And then the then Prince Charles just had to put it over their head. Problem solved. Now, he says on the rare occasions when he was feeling poorly, and he hardly ever felt poorly, he said it was, the picture of health, that he loved being fussed over and he loved being looked after. Don't we all? Don't we all? And he would take to his bed, and of course none of his family would visit him because they would all have engagements and they couldn't risk getting sick. So there would just be phone calls. So it'd just be Stephen Barry looking after him. And then he said he sort of became quite close to the prince, and he had to act as a barrier between the prince and the world, the outside world. And this could lead to resentment from other members of the family and also other members of staff, because they would ask to see the prince, and it'd be Stephen Barry's job to say no politely. So household or members of his office would ask to see him, and I'd see the prince. Oh no, not today, he'd say. Tell them I'll see them tomorrow, Stephen. You fix it. So he would have to lie and have to say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, he's got another engagement. And then they would say, well, what engagement? And then he'd be stuck in the lie and having to invent things. And yeah, very difficult to lie for somebody else, isn't it? Very difficult. Being the person closest to him at the time, we developed a friendship, only a working friendship, of course. I was the one who was there first thing in the morning when no one else was about and his office was closed. Once he'd eaten dinner, I would go in and say, good night, sir, wait for his good night, Stephen, and then I'd close the door and leave him in peace. But he did say that sometimes he would be on call. He'd actually turned one of his rooms into a library for him for all his naval books. And sometimes he would get a late night phone call asking him where a particular edition or a particular book would be, because he'd catalogued it all. And he'd offer to actually head up there and find him the book. And he'd say, no, just tell me where it is. Which was easier said than done, I would imagine. Easier said than done. He says that sometimes he did get a little bit testy and a little bit frustrated, particularly when they were on tour. But he said he was always quite reasonable with him. He never really got overly wounded or frustrated or felt like he was picking on him in any way. So he sounds like a pretty good boss. But he says the 4 things that would really make him cross: the noise of plumbing, gurgling away in the night, the hiss and drip of an air conditioner, and not being able to open windows because they'd been sealed, and perhaps most of all, the miserable little hotel towels. Now, I can sympathise with miserable little hotel towels. Can you? Yes. Fortunately, he rarely became annoyed with me. On tours, before we started off, he would warn me, Stephen, if I shout at you, don't take any notice. You know I have to let off steam somehow. I didn't mind. I understood. It used to amuse me, however, how much he used to grumble about the cost of things, complaining he couldn't afford them. For example, if he wanted to buy someone a present, he'd have a selection of gifts sent in. Gosh, aren't they expensive, he'd say. And then he'd always pick something that was about middle value. He was very careful with his money. I used to carry his money for him, and he was very trusting. All those years that I did his shopping, he would just leave it to me. If he wanted something, I would buy it. The account would go to the office, I'd sign the bill, and that would be it. And he said that it was up to him to actually tip people when he stayed at a hotel. Often he would leave £20, £10 for the prince, £5 for him, and £5 for the policeman that accompanied them. But if they stayed for 3 nights, then they would leave £50. And invariably the prince would complain and say, that sounds a bit steep, Stephen, in the car on the way back home. Now, he says here, I personally was being paid £434 a month when I left. So this was after his, 12 years of service. That was what he was being paid, £434 a month, plus perks, all food and board, and he says, and a very good address, Buckingham Palace. I may have found somewhere to live, said the prince one day, August 1980. The duchy are investigating it, and it was, of course, Highgrove. And he asked Stephen Barry and his then policeman to go up and check it out and come back and tell him what they thought of the property. And it's interesting that Stephen Barry said that it was quite a small house, though it looks enormous from the outside, and it's rather long. I think it's a very manageable house, I told him when I got back to the palace. I think I'm going to buy it, he said. Well, but there's no bed there, said Stephen Barry. And so the prince said, well, go and buy one. So off Stephen Barry went. The kitchen was bare. We had a rather ancient gas stove, a very small fridge, and not much else. I went off to Hills and Harvey Nichols to buy the necessities, but with strict instructions from him, don't spend too much, he said. The prince, the policeman and I did all the moving, and the prince thoroughly enjoyed it. And then when they got to that night, he said, how's your cooking? And he said, oh, all right. And he made eggs Florentine, eggs from Highgrove and spinach from the garden. And they all sat in front of the TV and enjoyed that. And then the next day, they were putting more things away. A lot of them were gifts from tours that they'd been on, and they were finding sort of a home for everything. And they collapsed in the one habitable room at the end of that and ate bacon sandwiches and watched TV and snoozed in a few armchairs. So he said it was, in fact, a fabulous weekend. We were working hard but really enjoying ourselves. From then on, he went down to Highgrove every weekend from Friday morning to Monday evening. Well, that's a 4-day weekend. That's a long weekend. Friday morning to Monday evening. Oh, wow. The then Prince Charles, I think he works even harder now. But yes, that is a long weekend. That's 4 days off and 3 days on, isn't it? The prince pottered about there very happily. Highgrove was his first home, and he wanted to hang his own pictures and arrange his own treasures. Now, he was, of course, in the Navy at this point, and he said the Navy was pretty accommodating and gave him a lot of leave. But when he was the captain of the minesweeper, Bronnington, in 1976, Stephen Barry hardly saw him. And so Stephen Barry used to have to take on other duties, and he went back to being a page because he did not live on board ship with him. He did train up his steward a little bit, and the prince admitted that the experience for him was actually pretty good, but he was pretty glad when it was over. And one morning, I met the Queen in the lift because he was acting as a page again. Her page of presence was escorting her, and I was escorting the page of presence. She said to me, "Good morning, Stephen. You're keeping your hand in, are you?" "Just until the Prince comes back, Your Majesty," I said. He left the Navy in 1976, and life went back to normal for both of us. So that was the end of chapter 5. I'm going to give you another chapter. Chapter 6, and this is titled Family Homes Away from Home. Now, they were at Balmoral and they had a little bit of a security scare. 2 young girls dressed in T-shirts and rolled up jeans were coming through the long windows that led into the vestibule. They were dripping water and they looked remarkably dishevelled. What they'd done is they'd climbed down an embankment and waded across the River Dee. And once into the grounds, they'd actually slipped into the house through the long windows, left open to let in the summer air. These young girls meant no harm, but they did frighten everybody, and Stephen Barry had to duck off and get the policeman, and the policeman escorted them out because they wanted to see the Queen. There was no way that was happening. But Stephen Barry says very few people who make extraordinary efforts to get near the royals do mean any harm. In Britain, we have to guard them more from enthusiasts more than mental cases. But I mean, this is back in the late 70s. Early 80s, so that's the time of the IRA. I mean, I know they were in Scotland, so not in Ireland, but I mean, you would think that security would have to be beefed up a bit around that time. The royal year is very precise. Now, this is interesting because I feel like this is incorrect, but maybe it was correct at the time. He says Christmas is spent at Windsor. I always thought it was Christmas at Sandringham, didn't you? Then on to Sandringham in Norfolk for 6 weeks in January. So maybe they used to have Christmas at Windsor, then on to Sandringham. Well, that's what he says. Then back to Windsor for Easter, returning to London in June for overseas visitors like President Reagan's visit in 1982. Then back to Windsor for Ascot Week, London again in July for the garden parties, and on to Britannia for Cowes Week in August. Gee, they must miss the Royal Yacht, Britannia. They must, because it was so much a part of their childhood. It was so much a part of their time as a family. And they had so many fun times on the Royal Yacht Britannia. There's that clip of the Queen wiping away a tear at the decommissioning of the Yacht Britannia. And I've actually got a book here on an old vintage book on the Yacht Britannia. It's got some gorgeous photographs of the family having fun on it and details about life on board. And yeah, I think it was quite sad for them, really. I mean, I suppose they've still got the Royal Train, which is good, but it would have been hard to give up. The highlights of the 10 weeks in Scotland are the 2 Gillies Balls. They start at 10 p.m. after everyone has dined. Jack Sinclair's musicians, a well-known Scottish band, play from the gallery, and long dead stags stare down from the walls at the goings-on. All the royal ladies dress and wear their Royal Stuart sashes and tiaras, and men wear their kilts. It's a lovely gathering and great fun with dancing, being fairly civilised until after the midnight refreshments. Then the noise grows and the dancing becomes wilder, while the music is punctuated by Highland whoops. But at least at Balmoral there's no fear of disturbing the neighbours. Now, he talks about the King and Queen of Belgium and the Queen of Belgium because they all have the estate workers for the Gillies Balls, of course. And she ended up with one of the estate workers and they were doing a stately waltz. And she said, "Oh, tell me, what do you do?" And he said, "I'm the estate carpenter, Your Majesty." And the Queen of Belgium said, "Oh, how interesting." And then her face brightened. "Ah, yes, my husband would have liked to have been a carpenter." And then the result of that was that a bemused carpenter spent the next day going around saying, "Can you imagine? He wants to be a carpenter. He doesn't like being a king at all." Most of the Balmoral holiday is spent shooting for grouse on the moors. The royal family, fresh air fiends to a man, have barbecues at night, taking the food out to primitive cottages, invariably ones without electricity. That's where I'm getting the invariably from, because I keep saying invariably, 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 and I realise it's because Stephen Barry says invariably, invariably. He says it quite a bit. So this is where he tells about Prince Philip designing that special Land Rover for the picnics, and it was quite ingenious at the time. I mean, it had a refrigerated compartment and it had, gas burning, and, it was like the modern sort of camping trailers that you would buy now, but he designed it and got it built especially for the back of his very favourite Land Rover. The family do stick together. They are very close, and they are happiest when they're rid of all the staff, but only for a while. They don't mind serving themselves. They don't mind cooking, but clearing up is out. Well, I actually have heard that up at Wood Farm the Queen loved to wash up. So I don't know what you're implying there, Stephen Barry. The Queen, who frequently lunches alone, does the Telegraph crossword puzzle as a little relaxation while she eats. She needs relaxation. Her work never stops. Wherever she is, boxes and dispatches are sent up to Balmoral, Sandringham, or wherever she happens to be. She deals with what is called the boxes every day. And he goes on to say that when she has people to stay at Balmoral, she acts like any other hostess. She goes up and checks the bedroom. She checks there's fresh flowers. She checks that everything is neat and comfortable, and that there's fresh towels and it's all pretty and the windows are clean and all that sort of thing. So she does care. And then this is really, really interesting. When guests come, this is what happens. So usually they arrive at 6 p.m, okay, and then on arrival, they're met by an equerry or a lady in waiting who takes them into the drawing room where the Queen is waiting to greet them, and then they're offered drinks and everything. And then the Queen herself shows people to their assigned rooms. Then between 6 and 7 is quiet hour, where everyone just does what they like, rest, change for dinner, read or watch television. So there must be television in the rooms, that's good. Then the entire party meets downstairs at 8. and dinner is served at 8:30. Now, he says no matter how well someone knew the Queen, he never really saw anyone kiss her hello or goodbye. They always bowed or curtsied and were quite formal, even people that she was quite intimate with. Country house visits with the Queen are not exactly restful. What with the shooting, the walking and the general activity that goes on, one guest was heard to say, "I'm exhausted, at least it's Sunday tomorrow and we can have a lie-in." But they had to get up for church, didn't they? And then he said one of the things that I think I've said in another video, that when the Queen left to go to bed around midnight at Balmoral, that was the time to make your escape. Because if you didn't, you would be stuck with Princess Margaret singing till 2 or 3 in the morning. The Queen's great interest is in breeding horses and dogs. She trains her own gun dogs and works very hard with them. Approaching Balmoral, one sees a notice board for car drivers. It reads, "Slow, beware horses, dogs and children. The Queen trained and bred the Prince's golden retriever Harvey, who is a large friendly animal that unfortunately is not house trained." And Stephen Barry used to follow Harvey around with a bottle of soda water and some blotting paper. Another one of my duties while they're up at Balmoral was to walk Harvey at Buckingham Palace when needed. He had to walk Harvey. Before taking out Harvey, if the Queen was in residence, I would always ring her page to make sure she was not going to be in the garden herself. One afternoon, when Harvey needed to go out, I made the usual telephone call. "Is the garden free?" I asked the Queen's page. "Yes," he said, "she's in the sitting room. It's all right." So he set off with Harvey bounding before him. I had 40 acres to manoeuvre in, and I shot off in another direction, dragging Harvey, because he saw a figure in the distance. He saw a lady that looked suspiciously like the late Queen in her headscarf with her corgis, and they weren't supposed to sort of bump into the family. You know, they were meant to sort of avoid them and give them their space if they were in the garden, so he shot off in another direction. About 20 minutes later, the corgis unfortunately spotted Harvey and rushed over to join him. With them came the Queen, and we were face to face, and I just wanted to jump into a bush because he felt like he'd done the wrong thing and that he'd been intrusive. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," I said, "but I did ring the page." No, she said, "it's perfectly all right. I've been trying to catch you for about half an hour. I want to see how Harvey's getting on. I didn't realise he was in London." And because she'd bred Harvey and the dog was so rarely at the palace, when she spotted him through the garden window, she jumped out through those doors and went off after them, trying to catch them. Harvey helps pay for the Sandringham kennels because he was used for breeding. And he was also shown at Crufts as a royal representative of the dog world. "Will you show him?" the Prince's office asked me. The Prince can't do it himself. I declined. I'd have been embarrassed walking around Crufts in +4s hoping Harvey would behave. So it doesn't sound like Stephen Barry is really all that much in love with Harvey, does it? And he talks about the Queen's own 11 dogs, including a few varieties from mistakes with other royal dogs, who live in her apartments and go wherever she goes, pattering at her feet and sleeping around her where she sits. They don't bite as many people as rumoured, he says. When the dogs get very old and the vet recommends they be put away, the Queen always has them buried at Sandringham. And one day he went into the Prince's room and the Prince was really upset. And he said, "I can't bear it. They're going to bury Heather." And Heather was a 3-legged, 1.5-eared, long-time favourite who had a habit of getting into fights with other dogs, and apparently she lost her last battle. So they're all dog lovers in the royal family, aren't they? He goes on to say about the shooting lunches at Sandringham, and there was a funny incident with a young footman and Princess Margaret. "I will always remember the embarrassment of one young footman who picked up the coffee pot and advanced on Princess Margaret to refill her cup. What he hadn't noticed was that the burner had stuck to the bottom of the pot, and just as he reached the princess, down it fell, landing into her napkin and setting it alight. All the royals fell about in hysterics, delighted, and the Queen called out, 'Oh, look, they're trying to burn Margot.'" They used to have fire drills at Sandringham, and eventually the local from the near village, the fire engine would rock up. One evening after the routine, the Queen, as usual, told her page to tell the yeoman of the cellar to give the firemen some beer in the ballroom. Now, after they left, she went up to the yeoman of the cellar and said, "Oh, Whiteling, how much did they drink?" "6 dozen bottles, Ma'am," he told her. "Good heavens," she said, 6 dozen bottles. I dread to think what they've drunk if there'd been a real fire." Dinner was always late after fire practice, and he said that, all of them loved any disruption to their normal routine. They just found it really exciting and really interesting. And there was an incident on one of the fire drills. Princess Margaret refused to get up, and the Queen Mother was being escorted down and, came across this very distressed maid on the landing that was outside Princess Margaret's room. And she said, "Whatever's the matter?" And she said, "Well, Princess Margaret won't get up." And the Queen Mother said, "Oh dear," fingering a long strand of pearls, "she'd just have to burn, won't she?" Eventually, major restoration had to be done at Sandringham, and the house was uninhabitable for 2 years. And during that time, there was quite a few sort of famous Australians. The Governor-General of Australia, Sir John Kerr, who of course was very famous for dismissing the Whitlam government. And also there was Dame Zara Holt. After Harold Holt actually disappeared at Portsea, he drowned, she was invited over to Sandringham, but they both stayed at Wood Farm. And when Dame Zara actually went there, the royals were still at church, and so she'd arrived unexpectedly early. So she hopped back in the car and went for a drive around. Meanwhile, Princess Margaret, who never went to church, was actually got up so that when Dame Zara came back, there would be someone to greet her. So she was waiting in the sitting room, and Prince Andrew bounced in on one of those bouncy balls, with the ears that he'd got for Christmas. "Who are you waiting for?" he wanted to know. "Dame Zara," the princess told him. "She's come a long way from Australia." Prince Andrew considered this, and then he said, "If she's from Australia, perhaps she'd like to play with my kangaroo." "I don't think so, darling," Princess Margaret said gravely. "She's just lost her husband, so I don't suppose she wants to play with anyone today." Going off to Balmoral or Sandringham was an expedition, and there used to be up to 80 staff that used to follow them from residence to residence. There's not so much now. They've cut it down a lot. On holiday, there were generally 4 servants to every royal and guest. The Queen's Cinema also travelled with us, and this was operated by the Pipe Major. Now, the Pipe Major is the one who at Balmoral every morning pipes for the Queen, a tradition which began with Queen Victoria, who liked the sound of bagpipes. And I believe the late Queen Elizabeth II loved the bagpipes too. I wonder if it's still going now. Now, every morning the Pipe Major can be seen marching up and down outside the Queen's window, puffing like mad, and he has to get it right because the Queen has a very good ear for music. Now, in the interest of cutting down all these staff, these 80 staff, they actually said that Bobo MacDonald, who was the Queen's old dresser, had to actually go down for meals, that she couldn't be waited on anymore by a footman to have a tray brought up to her, and she objected to this. So she used to get her under sort of maid to sneak down to the kitchen and bring it back up in secret until she came up with a plan. Bobo struck on the idea of having a permanent cold. Such a bad cold that her meals had to be delivered on trays as before. That cold indeed proved permanent. She is still the only member of staff who is served her food when the royals are at Sandringham. And that's the end of chapter 6. Good old Bobo. How clever to actually come up with a permanent cold. I'll be back next week with chapter 7 and chapter 8. I'll see you then. It is such a great book, isn't it? Leave your comments down below so I can hear what you love about it too. See you then. Bye.